I'm Maura. I'm Maura's Wednesday. I'm going to read a poem by Robert Frost. He loved poetry, particularly poems. And this is called Reluctance. Out through the fields and woods, and over the walls I have waited. I have climbed the hills of view and looked at the world and said, I have come by the highway home, and lo, he's in. The leaves are all dead on the ground, save those that the oak is keeping to rattle them one by one, and let them go scraping and creeping out over the crusted snow. And others asleep. And the dead leaves lie huddled and still, no longer blown hither and thither. The last known aster is gone, the flowers of the witch hazel wither. The heart is still aching to sleep, but the feet question whither. Ah, into the heart of man was it ever less than a treason to go with the drift of things, to yield with grace to reason, and vow and accept the end of love or a season.
My name is Rylan, and I am one of Robert's sons-in-law. I'm married to Maura. And today I'm going to be reading a selection of Robert's favorite poems, also by Robert Frost. The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had warned them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled, and that has made all the difference.
Not panic. The rest of the speeches will not be this long. My father was one of the last great funeral builders. If he knew you and someone in your life died, then my dad would be at that funeral. You would be amazed who won't show up at your funeral, my dad once told me. Nowhere to sit down. It is the highest honor for me to offer praise of my Father in this sacred place and from my family to all those that have shown us support both today and over the past week. We say thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Dad was the most powerful influence in my life. His influence so instructed the person I am that I find it difficult to know where to start in painting a picture of him for you. I knew him as my father, and I can only tell you about him from my perspective. Hopefully each of the speakers today will provide a part of his portrait that is at once familiar to you as well as surprising. My father was a deeply complex and fascinating person. Dad had charisma, the kind of mysterious charm that people wish for, but few possess. He was only 21 years old when I was born, and as a young child, I regarded him as my hero. Over the years, that image was both burnished and tarnished a bit, as a child often learns that the ideal has some distance from reality. The man he was, though, never failed to capture my imagination, and even when our relationship was somewhat rocky, his larger-than-life presence informed both my life decisions and my personal philosophy. My father was more uncomfortable in the role of a parent than any other he had in life. He would admit that, I think. As a parent myself now, I understand why. It is life's most difficult and demanding role, and it's almost impossible to gauge how well you're doing, at least for a while. One of the ways in which I try to emulate my father as a parent is by imparting overarching principles to my children, or tools for living. I cherish these gifts more than any material gift he gave me. For me, this is his legacy, and he lives on through his children and his grandchildren, whom he loved dearly. These principles that guided his life comprised his character, and it was his character that made him my hero and my mentor. Dad had a deep sense of social justice. The kernel of this ideal was sown in childhood. He grew up on the wrong side of the tracks, as he would like to say, and he lived with his grandparents, his mother, and his beloved brother, Rylan. His parents divorced when he was only 2, and that event forever changed him. He regarded himself as an outsider, the Italian-looking kid with a funny name who lived on the wrong side of the tracks. He never suffered bullies, and as his dear friend Wayne Gerald once told me, no one ever messed with Robert. He would settle things with his fists if he had to back then, and he was one of the toughest guys I ever met. He could not abide anyone who took advantage of a weaker person, and he demanded respect and dignity for himself and others. Once, when my family lived in a small town in eastern North Carolina, I recall my father and I went shopping at a five and dime called TG&Y. If those of you remember what five and dimes were. Dad had stepped a few feet away from me to do some shopping, and I was looking at some items on my own, yet within his view. Much like my father, I was a bit of an outsider too. It was the early 70s. I was a half Caucasian, half Asian kid living in a small town. And while at that store, a boy a little bit older than me walked up to me. He began to mock me and call me various slurs. And this will be familiar to you, particularly if you knew my father back then. He stormed over there. He heard what had taken place, and he stood over me like he was protecting me, and he said loudly to this young boy, "Where is your father? Where is your father?" And that boy ran off in a fright, but my father, he fumed. He told me he was going to settle that whole matter with that boy's father if he could just find him. I was glad he never found him. During that same time period, I came home one day and complained of a neighborhood boy who was making fun of me and the way I talked. It was not easy being a half Asian kid with a southern accent, a rarity even today. My father was incensed. I must caveat this story by saying one should never solve disputes with fisticuffs, but my father felt that his little girl would not be intimidated by a boy. So for the next few nights after he came home from work, he taught me how to deck someone. I can see him now, sitting hunched on the edge of his chair. He was lean back then, with shocks of wavy black hair and real light in his eyes. He held out his 2 hands like this, and here I was, this tiny girl standing opposite him and shadowboxing into his hands. He told me that the next time that boy felt the need to make fun of a girl, then I should clock him. I followed his instructions, and well, no one messed with me after that. One of the most formative experiences of my father's life was his time at Gaston College. He was a starter on the basketball team there. He was an avid basketball fan for his entire life. I am sure some of you have endured his recounting of the glory days of his sports career. What you may not know is that this experience deeply affected his personal philosophy. He played on one of the earliest racially integrated illustrated teams in the South. One of his dear friends from that period of life will speak to you today. He won't tell you that he's the head coach for the Florida State men's basketball team, but I'm going to tell you that. From the time I was a young child, Dad told me stories of how that team would ride on a bus to away games throughout the South, sometimes all night, so that they could find a hotel that would take all the players, not just the white ones. Dad would say we were a team. If a hotel wouldn't take all of us, then they would take none of us. Years later, on a trip to Gastonia with my parents, an African-American gentleman approached my dad in a restaurant. They embraced and shared a genuine happiness in having run into each other by chance. And I'll never forget what that man said to my father. He said, "Robert, do you remember those nights riding through Georgia on that bus? That was some time." I have an enduring pride that my dad took a stand on the right side of history and morality at a time when many did not. And just as my father believed deeply in racial equality, he believed in gender equality also. He told me repeatedly as I was growing up, "You can be anything you want. You can be the President of the United States." It was kind of a mantra for him, and it always stuck with me. Perhaps because he was setting the bar kind of high. Dad was a great citizen patriot. He instilled within me a great love of the American system of government. He used to say, "There is no better place in the world. You can't show me a better system." My mother became an American citizen when I was a very young girl. My father loved to tell the story of her naturalization ceremony at the local courthouse. He said he had tears in his eyes as the judge asked each new citizen to look at the moon that night and know that on it was planted an American flag. My father's great love of country was forged early in life when he worked for local attorney Mr. John Ingram, who later had a storied political career in North Carolina. Dad had a real admiration for Mr. Ingram, and he so wanted to be an attorney like him. My father even saved money to buy a set of legal textbooks, which he pored over in his spare time. He lamented that his obligations forced him to work so hard with little time to dedicate to furthering his education and realizing his dream to be an attorney. So he made up his mind that his child would be an attorney. When I graduated from law school and was admitted to the North Carolina bar, I know he was proud. And even though I stopped practicing law to raise my children, he made me promise to keep my license current. Each year, as I sat in class and fulfilled the requirements of my state law license, I would send him a text or email, playfully complaining about the time and money I was expending to keep my promise to him. I'm glad I made that promise. It is fitting today that we hold this service in King. We spend all our time as a family in this community, and it is a great testament to my father's patriotism. You see, he did not find patriotism in just song or show. He found it in rolling up his sleeves and building a community. When he was elected the first mayor of this town in 1984, he was tasked with creating a fire department, a sanitation department, and a police department where none existed. He helped expand the library, build King Recreation Acres, and other projects. He did none of these on his own, but he was the town's leader then. I can tell you that he took these tasks extremely seriously and considered his duty to the people as sacred. His public life was so important to him, and unlike so many people that I know, he really put himself out there in significant measure. I recall that someone had written a rather critical editorial letter in the local paper once. Of course, he took issue with the criticism, but the thing that bothered him most was that the letter to the editor was signed anonymous. He could not understand why anyone would be so cowardly as to divorce their name from their opinion. Dad had taken a stand, right or wrong, and he always expected the opposition to meet him in the arena with the same courage and honor. In his capacity as mayor, he performed the big tasks very well, but there were little tasks that some perhaps never phone calls at our home at all hours of the night with complaints both big and small. There were some days when citizens even knocked on our front door with questions for the mayor. I recall a few times when the people who came to call were a bit challenged in terms of their faculties or mental status. And my dad would speak to them with respect and deftly manage their very odd complaints and requests in a way that sent them from our door feeling that someone had listened to them. He never, ever spoke ill of them, and he never would speak ill of someone he perceived as disadvantaged or socially marginalized. His time as mayor reinforced love of country, and he would proudly proclaim over and over, there are only 3 executive offices in the country, you know: president, governor, and mayor. Dad was never a cynic about government. He would have equated it to being a cynic about the American people, as he viewed government as the most elegant expression of the will of the people. All who have the privilege of representing that will have the highest obligation to the community. He found the greatest translation of this philosophy in the words of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which he loved to read aloud to me. I read it to my daughters just as he read it to me. Dad also felt community was linked to opportunity. He identified with the rugged individual that pulled himself up by his own bootstraps, but he knew that rugged individual could not do it alone. The mentors in his life grew to have an almost mythical quality when we talked about him. Mr. John Ingram, the crusading and eccentric lawyer who always thought outside the box. Mr. J.D. Truman, without whom my family simply wouldn't be here. Sarge from Gaston College, the disciplined military man who took my mom and dad under his wing and helped them get their start in life. Mr. Ted Howard, the quiet man who wore a fedora and gave Dad a chance at American credit when no one else would hire him. Mr. Joe Marshall, who helped shape my father's career during a critical time and whom Dad loved and admired greatly. There were others as well. My dad started out as a depot man, but he worked his way up to the top of community banking in this state. He was proud of that, and he loved his persona as a poor country boy with a degree from the School of Hard Knocks. But what he always acknowledged was he didn't get there alone. And Dad often took the role of mentor himself in order to pay it forward. If a friend or family member didn't have a job, then Dad would find one. And if someone was in need, then Dad helped him or her. Perhaps he helped some of you here today. The side Dad often kept hidden from his public persona was his fiercely intellectual and creative side. This was the greatest gift he gave to me, and it has sustained me. He often said to me, freedom of thought is the greatest gift from God, and no one can take it away from you but God himself. My father was a great dreamer. As a boy, while his grandfather James, who he said was the most honest man he ever knew, and his beloved brother Hiram toiled in the family fields, you could find Dad under a shade tree, sitting on an upside-down bucket with his chin on his 2 hands, dreaming big dreams. He would tell me that he could go anywhere in his mind, an ironic statement as he hated going outside the 25-mile radius of his home. As a younger man, he was a voracious reader. The books from the Book of the Month Club couldn't arrive quickly enough at our door. He loved Milton's Paradise Lost and the poems of Robert Frost. He loved music and learned to play the guitar from Renard Griffin. Dad's singing voice was full and beautiful. He even played trombone for a short while in the King Moravian Church band. And one of his great joys was to hear Billy Long sit down at our piano and play just about anything. So many of my early childhood memories are of Dad strumming his guitar while he sang. Not just any songs, but real American troubadour songs. In particular, he loved Bob Dylan. Any Bob Dylan song, even the weird ones. He loved Harry Chapin's Dark Odes to Dreams Deferred and Love Lost. One of his favorites was Chris Christopherson's Sunday Morning Coming Down, and he he often remarked that Christopherson was maybe the perfect songwriter, not just a common man's poet and an outlaw, but a road scholar too. No list of my dad's favorite singer-songwriters would be complete without George Jones. Dad did a great rendition if he stopped loving her today. He would want you to know he had range, though, and he also loved R&B music. If James Brown was on, Dad was dancing. He could sing and dance to all the Motown standards and prided himself on knowing just about any dance that had been invented in the 60s. I can still see him running through all the songs in Wilson Pickett's Land of a Thousand Dances. His specialty was the mashed potato. And if he really wanted to make us laugh, which he often did, he literally would leap onto our coffee table and start doing the twist. I once had a cassette tape recorder as a child. I was very excited at the prospect of using it. Very quickly found out that I really had nothing to say, and I was rather mortified at how terribly distorted my voice was on the playback. So Dad thought he would put the recorder to good use. He recorded songs on it. He did comedy skits and dramatic readings. And boy, would I wouldn't get to have those tapes today. During that time, when my father was at the height of his intellectual ferocity, he wrote poems that he allowed me to read. Looking back, I'm honored that he respected me enough to read his verse, though it was way above my head at the time. He was a great thinker and philosopher, and even when my dad and I had rocky times, and there were rocky times, we held this part of our relationship close. One of the ways in which we communicated was through debate. Mind you, my entire family is a bit argumentative, and it is seldom that one person says something about anything that goes unchallenged even to this day. My father and I were particularly combative in this sense, and these exchanges often occurred at the dinner table. One especially heated debate was theological in nature. He was a man of unwavering faith, and it concerned the coexistence of free will and determinism. My father was insistent that both existed, demanded that I also believe this. And when I challenged him on it, the whole issue expanded into a debate that raged for what must have been months. We never resolved it, and we often referred to it as the Great Debate. Just a week or so before his death, I asked him to watch an interesting documentary on the financial meltdown. I had only watched half of it, but I knew he would like it. Within 24 hours, he emailed me back with his thoughts, and I learned that he had watched all 4 parts in quick succession. He always was the first person with whom I wanted to share an intellectually interesting idea, and I'll miss that. To my father, I say farewell and Godspeed. The void you leave is the void that shall remain. I want to close with one of my father's favorite quotes. It is from a famous speech by Theodore Roosevelt, another forward-thinking, tough man of the people. This one's for you, Dad. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold